Okay, good evening and welcome everybody. We are about to begin. Our guest speaker has joined us, as has most of our Rotarians. I'm sure as we go through the formalities and welcome, we'll have others joining in time for Prof's presentation. Can I please ask everybody to mute themselves so that we don't get any disruptions in the background? So if you can please mute, you can keep your videos on or off, whatever you prefer. It would be nice to see you.
Thank you, President Sharman. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone and declare the meeting open.
Thank you, Sergeant Clive. Once again, a very warm welcome on this chilly Thursday evening down here in Port Shepstone. It is lovely to see everybody who has joined us. Welcome to everybody, our Rotarians, members from other Rotary groups. We've got the independent newspaper will be joining to listen to Prof, as well as fellow guests and our local community who we extended invites to. So names are too many to mention, but we're really honored to have you join us this evening. This is our fellowship meeting. We do have 2 meetings a month as part of our club down here in Port Shepstone. The first is our business meeting, and the second, which is on the 4th Thursday of every month, is our fellowship and showstopper meeting where we have a guest speaker. So this is what you have joined this evening, and we welcome you to our club meeting for today. I'd like to, at this stage, declare the meeting open, as Sergeant has said, and I'd like to begin by handing over to our Rotarian, John, who will start the meeting with a little invocation to get the evening and the meeting started. So John, over to you.
Good evening. Let us take a moment to remember that all religions present in the Rotary family worldwide are welcome to pray together with us tonight. Will you please bow your heads with me? Almighty God, as we gather here together as members and friends of Rotary, we pray that we may ever be mindful of the opportunities to render our service to this South Coast community. Help us to keep in mind always the enduring value of life and the fact that we are generally blessed with lives of relative luxury and privilege unknown to thousands of disadvantaged around us. We acknowledge your power and your expectation that we be aware of service to mankind. Tonight, as we listen about how this obligation needs to be fulfilled, we look to the future with a new commitment to help those that lead our country and to fulfill our duty to those who are our neighbors and not as prosperous as we are. Guide us in our service. If it be thy will, keep us safe from this COVID virus so that we can serve and bless those around Port Shepstone, those who need so much to be touched, first by you, Lord, and then by us and our resources. Remind us that we are universally, of all peoples and all nations, subscribed to the standards set by your golden rule. There would be no crimes and no violence and no destruction if we all did that. We seek to look after and keep the streets of our cities and towns safe so that there's no crime one against the other, no longer any unemployment, no suffering, and no hunger. Give us open minds to what we are about to hear, and may we depart from this time that we spend together with a better understanding of how and where we can make with steady purpose the use of our club's resources in the future, helping others. We pray this prayer in the name of all that is holy. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Rotarian John Landless. Those beautiful words. I'd like to, at this stage, hand over to our past president, Eric Burr, who is also the treasurer of our club. And Eric will be reminding us of the Rotary 4-way test. Eric?
4-way test of the things we think and
say or do? The first one, is it the truth? The second one, is it fair to all concerned? The third one, would it build goodwill and better relationships? And finally, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that. Ladies and gentlemen, at this stage on our agenda, we did have the slot allocated to introduction of guests. We do have over 62 participants at this stage. It would be wonderful to network and hear who you are and who you represent, but unfortunately time constraints will not permit. So we will hopefully do a screenshot and be able to network with you going forward. But if there's anybody who would like to just do a special welcome to any of the guests at this stage, I'd like to open the floor to you to say anything that you would like to say before we commence with Prof Turton's discourse.
Can I just say something, please?
Sure.
Initially, we were scheduled for me to speak for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then I had to hand over to another meeting. That second meeting has in fact been cancelled because of the load shedding. So, in other words, there is no back end. If you, in other words, we don't have a hard deadline. If that's what suits you. So I just let you know about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. That's amazing. Great. So we're not pressed for time. Are there other Rotary clubs who have joined us this evening? If you represent any of the fellow Rotary clubs, please can you just maybe introduce yourself and just tell us which Rotary club, just for our interest purposes?
Lou Buerta from the Rotary Club of Newlands in Cape Town, and my wife Hilary is with me.
Welcome, Cape Town.
Thank you.
Another Cape Townian, Biffy Dankwitz from the E-Club of Greater Cape Town.
Okay, super, lovely. Hi. I see.
Arlene Rayburn from the Rotary Club of Edinburgh in Scotland.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Welcome. It's lovely to have you. And I see on our messages, we've got the Rotary Club of Dundee, represented by Bev Garner. Welcome, Bev. Hey. Thank you, everybody. At this stage, I'd like to then hand over to our past president, Ms. Rotarian Noel Coetzee, who will be introducing our guest speaker, and he is well known to everybody who has joined this evening. Prof Turton is a man known to many of us, but I would like to hand over to past President Noel, who will do a formal introduction of our guest speaker, and we're really honored to have you here tonight.
Thank you, President Shamin, and a very warm welcome to everybody this evening. It's so lovely to see such a broad spectrum of representation this evening, and we're all looking forward to hear what Professor Turton has to share with us this evening. By means of introduction, Professor Turton is a man of many talents, and he has recently been in the media with his incredibly insightful commentary on the current dynamics and unrest sweeping the country. We extend a warm welcome to you this evening from the Port Shepstone Rotary Club and look forward to your input, Professor. By way of background, Professor Turton has been the recipient of numerous accolades, some of which I'd just like to share with you this evening. He's received the Nick Steele Memorial Award, which is a South African Environmentalist of the Year Award, and he received that in 2010. He received the Green Globe Award as an Environmental Activist of the Year in 2012. He received the Wesser Award, which is a Lifetime Conservation as a Lifetime Conservation Achiever. He received that in 2016. He's a professor, the Center for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State. He's the editor of Africa Water Policy, the official journal of the World Water Council. He's a director of Janigraph, a director of Nanodyne Systems, and he's a strategist in terms of the water shortages in South Africa. He's a founding member and director of the Water Business Chamber. He's director of Amanzi for All and a director of Verdict Limited in Toronto. Professor Turton's skill set is somewhat unique in that they combine intelligence science and environmental science. His doctorate combined intelligence science with environmental science, focusing on rivers that cross international borders, and the intelligence science is about the decision-making under conditions of high risk, with incomplete and sometimes contradictory data. Whereas environmental science is about long data sets underpinned by a high confidence level. And today he advises confidential clients on risk and opportunity. Professor, you are a man of vast insights and experience, and your sharing with us an input and interpretation of the current situation in South Africa this evening is going to be deeply appreciated. I'd now like to hand over to you and wish you well as you share your knowledge and insights with us.
Thank you very much. I'm not muted. Okay, thank you very much. I'm deeply humbled by that. I'm a person that comes from a diverse background, and I'm a 12th generation African. My oldest relative having been the third Vryburger to ever have been given land on the Liesberg River. In fact, himself a refugee from the 30 Years' War that waged in Europe in the mid 1600s. So he came out with Jan van Riebeeck as a gunner, known as a hartbus-schutter. In other words, a flintlock gunner, and he became the garrison commander at Klapmuts, and he was murdered when the Cape Town Castle was being built. But nonetheless, I speak to you as an African, as a proud African, but as an African that was born into tumultuous times. I was born into literally the birth of the armed struggle, because at the age of 5 or 6 years, I witnessed the splitting of the African National Congress into the Pan-Africanist Congress and the birth of the armed struggle. And I also witnessed the very, very first part of the Defiance campaign, where there were long lines of people walking down the road, going somewhere. I didn't know where, but I was just a small boy. And I asked my father what's going on. And my father was an interesting man, because he spoke fluent Zulu. He grew up in a place called Hlabisa in Zululand, because his father, my grandfather, was in fact a let's call it an internally displaced person from the Civil War, from the Anglo-Boer War. And he, as a result of that, he was unable to get an education, so he became a squatter. As a squatter, he ended up with the only job he could get was as the clerk of the court, eventually in Hlabisa, Zululand. So my father grew up the son of a very poor man, but learning Zulu in the vernacular and being accepted very much into the Zulu culture and tradition. And it's something that I always hold very dear to me, because I've got a very high respect for the Zulu people and the Zulu nation. Something that I learned from my father. But what I learned from my father above all else was he has a traditional name, and his traditional name is Umngangabode, which refers to the reeds on the side of the river. Those reeds at a certain time of year, the same reeds that the maidens use in the reed dance, those reeds put up a head of seed every now and then. And this name refers to that head of seed above the reed bed. That means this individual stands above but remains part of the whole. So from a very young age in my life, I've always been imbued by the sense of my own insignificance as an individual, but my relevance as a human being being derived from being part of a greater whole. So I speak to you tonight in that context of being part of the greater whole. In this context, I'm part of the Port Shepstone community, although I haven't sort of embedded myself that deeply yet, and hopefully we can meet some more people after tonight. It's my intention to embed more deeply. I've had a house here for over 15 years, but I've only lived here permanently for the last 2 years. In my tumultuous life, having been born into the armed struggle, I served as a conscript in the Army, South African Defence Force, in an armoured reconnaissance unit, and served as an armoured soldier. Did my entire national service and all of my citizen force commitments I did, and I was recruited after the Pretoria car bomb went off. I was recruited into a special operations unit of the National Intelligence Service. At that point in time, they created this capability to track down and capture the chief of staff of Mkhonto Wesizwe, who was deemed to be responsible for the Pretoria car bomb. And that immersed me in the world of intelligence and special operations very deeply. And it's something I've written a book about, but it's something that for a long time, people in my professional space never spoke about those kind of things. It was almost as if it was an unspoken thing, part of our history. But what it did was it gave me a very, very deep insight into the intelligence process at a time of great turmoil and at a time of great transformation and change in South Africa, but not only in South Africa, also in the world. So in that position, I was privileged enough to work under a man called Dr. Neil Barnard, who made a very profound analysis when the Bureau of State Security, you might remember the old boss under B.J. Foster, fell into disrepute because it got involved in the info scandal, and it moved 30 million rand from one account to another, and it shouldn't have done it, and it was caught with its fingers in the cookie jar. And as a result of that, the Bureau of State Security failed, and a new entity was created. That new entity was National Intelligence Service. And the man in charge of that was Dr. Neil Barnard, who eventually became my boss. And the profound thing about Dr. Barnard was that he was asked to develop this new National Intelligence Service, national as opposed to state security. State security is to secure the state, and national intelligence is to secure the nation. So you have two things, the state and the nation, two fundamentally different. And Dr. Barnard came to this startling conclusion that if, as an intelligence service, we are expected to secure the state from its own people, then it implies that the government is illegitimate, and therefore we need to broaden the franchise. So believe it or not, the birth, the conception of our democracy happened in National Intelligence Service, deeply embedded in the secret space that very few people actually know about, and it is entirely counterintuitive. And I happened to be in one of his hand-selected members. We were part of maybe a 20-man team, 18 or 20 people that was selected for what was known as a special work group. And we created the intelligence capability to develop what we needed to know, the intelligence background, what we needed to know in order to determine whether we can transition to democracy or whether we should continue fighting a war in Angola and also at that point in time in the 1980s inside South Africa. So because I was privileged to be in that team, I was involved in a number of very special operations. And these operations have given me the insight that I can share with you tonight. And one of those was we had to have a profound understanding of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the White Right, the AWB, in other words, the political dynamics of the day. We had to understand in a profound way. Otherwise, we could not create this enabling environment for the establishment of CODESA and the ultimate transition to democracy. But part of that was we had to also understand what was happening in the Cold War. South Africa was a localized theater of the Cold War, and the Cold War was playing itself out in Angola at the last hot battle of the Cold War, the Battle of the Lomba. Most people might be aware of the Battle of Cuita-Cuanavalle, and the Battle of Cuita-Cuanavalle was really not a battle. It was a defensive action by FAPLA forces, because the real battle that determined the outcome of that war was the Battle of the Lomba, where a unit that I served with in my earlier life, 6th Mechanized Battalion, was a key player in the Battle of the Lomba. But be that as it may, I was involved as an intelligence officer in that process, where we had to understand what the Cubans were doing and what the Cubans were thinking, and that's another story I won't go into tonight, how that whole peace deal was brokered. But in that process, we had to also understand that there was a window of opportunity opening up at the end of the Cold War when we could negotiate, or at least consider negotiating a peaceful transition to a democratic future, as opposed to fighting a protracted war with little prospect of either side eventually winning. And that's the backdrop of this talk tonight, because in that context, on the one hand, we had to have this deep understanding of the dynamics of the African National Congress, SACP alliance, the so-called tripartite alliance. I wasn't an expert on the trade union movement because that was an internal organization and I wasn't working on that. I was working on the ANC and SACP. But we also got to understand the global dynamics that were at play. And what most people don't realize is that at the end of the Cold War, before the final battle of the Lomba, the Russian forces were defeated militarily in Afghanistan and were forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. And in that moment of defeat, in that moment of orderly withdrawal, I will add it, that was an orderly withdrawal, but they were defeated in that they didn't meet their military objective. And that vacuum that they created now enabled a moment in time when we could negotiate, we could consider negotiating a political transition. And that's what we did. We made that decision, you know all the history about that, when the government asked for the referendum, etc., etc. But I was deeply involved in a number of special operations at that time. And one of them was, I was inserted into Eastern Europe to go and determine whether the Russians had the capability of, in fact, supporting the other countries in the USSR at the time when the USSR was disintegrating. So I was up close and personal with Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, and with Erich Honecker in the GDR, East Germany, and with Václav Havel in the Czech Republic. I monitored those three transitions very closely on the ground, literally rubbing shoulders with the crowds in the streets. And what I witnessed there was a number of important events unfolding that I reported back up the line. And it is those same type of events that I've seen unfolding in South Africa in the last month. So it's those events that I'm now going to start going into, because that's the background that I've given you. What I've seen in the last week in particular, the last month in general, has been a series of watershed events that I consider professionally now to be truly transformational moment in our history. Because when we negotiated the political transition in 1994, what became known as CODESA, it was of necessity a compromise situation. All parties had to compromise. Neither party was capable of a military victory over the other. It was physically impossible. And we could continue fighting that war ad infinitum, and we were unlikely to ever achieve a military victory. Mkhonto weSizwe was unable to build up a force capability inside South Africa in order to create a decisive outcome. And the SADF was unable to decimate Mkhonto weSizwe and other liberation movements in their bases back in Tanzania, in Zambia, etc. We could hit them from time to time, but they would always regroup and always come back. So neither side could actually win. So the essence of the transformation was that it was a compromise on both sides. But the part of the compromise now was that the white minority that was now willing to talk to the black majority did so in good faith, and the assumption was that all sides would in fact negotiate from a position of good faith. But the technical details of the negotiation were that once you negotiate and you're giving away the power base that you have, control over the military forces, etc., once you've given that away, you cannot ever go back and retrieve it again. It's a one-way street. It's an irretrievable moment in time. So with the best of faith, the best of intentions, that those negotiations were entered into. And at that point in time, the assumption within the intelligence community was that the African National Congress was in fact a bona fide organization. It has, as of now, 100 years of deep history based on deep philosophy, on the moral high ground that's sellable to all kinds of actors all over the world. The defense of the oppressed masses, if you want, for a better word, is a highly noble concept, and people buy into that. The deepening of democracy is noble. The liberation of a people oppressed is a noble thought. So the depth, the intellectual depth, and the values base within the ANC was profound at that point in time. And there was always the consideration that will a liberation movement in Africa follow the same trajectory as all other liberation movements in Africa, where they fail to make a successful government in power after the liberation, after a couple of decades. What we called within the intelligence service, we refer to that as the Uhuru decade. The Uhuru decade, things work well, and then after that, things fall apart. And we understood that fairly profoundly. And our opinion at that point in time was that the African National Congress would become the government of the day and was likely to transform itself from a liberation movement into the government of the day by virtue of the demands made of a complicated government, the need to have sophisticated institutions in place to manage a diversified economy, the most industrialized economy on the continent of Africa. So it was our belief that the demands of government would force the liberation movement to transform itself to become a party of government. With hindsight, with the 2020 vision of hindsight, we now know that we were wrong in that assumption. The African National Congress has not transformed itself from a liberation movement into a party of government. And in fact, it is in terms of the evidence we've seen before us, our very eyes in the last week, it is unable to project authority beyond the posturing and beyond the let's call it the sort of window dressing of actually being in power. Clearly, the African National Congress is in power, but it's not always in control. Power and control are not the same thing. So I say this as a not to offend anybody, but I say this I would argue as a position of fact, because if the African National Congress was in authority, was actually in control over the last week, they would not have been caught as they were napping with the intelligence services not informing their client, the government of the day, in advance. That's what intelligence services are supposed to do. They did not inform the intelligence service, the client of the day, about this anticipated event, whatever the event is. We can talk about that now. But there was clearly a failing in the intelligence services there. But more alarmingly, there's also the possibility that some elements within the intelligence structures were in fact involved. So let's leave that as an open-ended question now, because that will be determined probably by proper investigations and ultimately end up, I would think, in courts of law. So let's not speculate on whether the intelligence services were involved in one way or the other. Not that is a fruitless conversation. But let us just home in onto what we saw in the last week, and then we'll sort of zoom out again on the good and the bad and the ugly of it. So what we saw last week was what appeared to be a relatively spontaneous uprising across parts of KZN that eventually spilled over into other parts, particularly Gauteng. But if we only look at that event, it appears to be a spontaneous uprising. But if you zoom out and you look at it in a little bit more textured landscape, more nuanced, more pixelated sort of set of data, you'll start seeing that it was not so spontaneous. And those of you on this platform tonight, most of you live in Port Shepstone area, and you'll be acutely aware that about 6 weeks ago, there was an uprising in the Port Shepstone area. And that uprising was extremely sophisticated in nature. I wrote about it on my Facebook page. I've got a blog on Facebook, and I wrote about it there. And what was sophisticated about that was there appeared to be 3 different mobile forces that had been unleashed for a period of time in a coordinated way that was capable of reaching specific objectives. And when I say specific objectives, I'm talking about intersections of roads, bridges, etc. That in so doing was able to simultaneously take control of those choke points and block off the movement of people, the free movement of people from Heberden all the way down to Port Shepstone. I would broadly say that effectively that was a dry run. It was a dry run of the big event to follow. it demonstrated a sophistication in command and control, a sophistication in the targeting of specific places, a sophistication that actually requires a very intelligent mind, a very intelligent, calculating, almost special forces kind of precision. And I would argue that if effectively what they were trying to do in their dry run was see if they could A, mobilize a general mass of people, of discontented people, and B, coordinate that uprising in such a way that they could in fact take control of specific choke points, and C, by so doing, effectively hold a community of people hostage. And when I say hostage, I refer to that in the broadest term, where hostage taking is where you deny the right of the individual being taken hostage, you deny them the right of the freedom of movement. We had people living in the complex that I live in that were unable to go to the airport, for example. They missed business meetings. They were unable to meet their business commitments, etc., because effectively the community was held hostage. So that happened a couple of weeks ago, and some of you on the platform will be aware of that event. But you'll also be aware that in Port Shepstone, what has been happening over the last 2 years that I'm aware of is the systematic targeting and hijacking of 18-wheel trucks that deliver baked beans, sausages, pork, whatever is needed into your retail outlets. And in fact, I've also been reporting about that on my blog. And what's been remarkable about those targeted hijackings is that in many cases, the police have been present. The police have even been visible at the event, but have never, ever lifted a finger. They've done nothing to prevent the looting of those trucks. So I would argue from a special operations perspective, that was also a series of dry runs, demonstrate capability to test whether the police are in fact capable of responding, and have got the appetite to respond. So that's another important thing. But then we zoom out. Just about a month ago in Port Edward, there was a very specific uprising. And that Port Edward uprising was covered by a colleague of mine, a former 6-1 MEC veteran soldier, who ended up as being a cameraman for the 50-50 camera crew. And he took photographs that ended up on the front page of the local newspapers of that uprising. And when I drove through that uprising the day after it had happened, I was struck, I was taken by the fact that what I was driving through here was a burnt out intersection that resembled Angola during the war. We were entering a war zone here in Port Edward a month ago. And that struck me as being quite profound. But then my mind started thinking about this. And then I zoomed out a little bit further. And those of you that live in the Port Shepstone area, you're all part of the Ugu District Municipality. And you will know that in Ugu, one of the things that's been happening over a period of time is the targeting of specific elements of water infrastructure, certain critical valves, certain critical pumps, certain critical elements of pipelines that have been selected by an intelligent mind. Because the selection of those targets implies that someone has sat down and looked at a map, looked at the flow diagrams, looked at what is known in engineering parlance as the P&IDs, the process and instrumentation diagrams, and said, that place there, if you take that thing out there, then this is going to happen. You're going to get a cascading effect. So you get the maximum effect with the minimum effort. So I would argue that there's been a dry run taking place in this area for some period of time. And each of those things has required a level of sophistication that to me speaks of great planning, great command and great control. So let us now, that's the background to what we saw in the last week. Let us now zoom out from that, what we saw last week, and let us now unpack this. So what we saw initially was a targeted, fairly sophisticated program using social media that put out posters saying that on midnight, on Sunday night, something's going to start happening, Monday it's going to happen. And I put those out in my blog because I consider them to be credible threats. And you remember, I'm an ex-intelligence officer, but I have no resources available to me at this point in time. So all I can do is I can just look and observe and read the newspaper and see what's going on and talk to people, but I don't have the processing capability from intelligence perspective that I used to have when I was a serving member of the service. I don't have any contact with those people. I'm completely out of the loop with respect to that. But I was able to call it, and I was able to say that something is happening. There's a revolution coming now. There's something that's different to the rest. So let's quickly zoom out and see what that thing was. There was a concerted attempt, a sophisticated attempt to lubricate the traditional cleavage line of South Africa, which is race. And we saw in that period of time the unleashing of the masses that they'd already attempted and tried in that hostage incident that I was telling you about between Port Shepstone and Hebridean. They demonstrated that they could in fact move these masses of people around, and they could get them to strike certain places at certain times. And you start getting information now from the owners of shopping complexes, and they talk about the fact that there was a strike within, when I say strike, a military type of strike within the shopping complex before the masses arrived. And that military penetration, if you like, for want of a better word, sent back information about where the guards are, where the weak points are, which entrance to come in, etc., etc. But also, more importantly, there's some evidence to suggest that there was a deliberate attempt to dismantle things like fire hydrants, fire suppression systems, etc. In other words, that needs more investigation to determine whether it's true or not, but it speaks to the presence of a sophisticated command and control and decision-making structure behind this thing. So once the crowds were unleashed, with this propaganda program or this information program unleashed on social media, designed to inflame and designed to mobilize people along racial lines, the good news is that failed. While people were mobilized, they were not mobilized on racial lines. And in fact, on the contrary, what we saw playing out towards the end of the week, when you now had community policing forums coming together, where community policing forums did not exist, you had the spontaneous arising emergence of what I call militia in what I've been writing about lately. These militia are spontaneous. They just happen on their own. They're not thought about beforehand. It's just simply a spontaneous uprising of people or organization of people, very often with some or other ex-military veteran involved in some or other decision-making position. So a number of my military colleagues were involved in a number of these events. But nonetheless, you saw this spontaneous organization of civil society, and it went across racial lines. So when I say that last week was a transformative moment for us as a nation, the transformative moment was there are two elements to that transformative moment. The first element of the transformation is the fact that all attempts that were made to lubricate the cleavage lines of race failed. So I would argue that last week, the history books in the future will very possibly refer to that week as the week in which South Africa came to terms with its sordid historic past. We face the ghost of all of our past evils, and they've all been racially inclined. So we managed to transcend race last week. That's the first thing that I see from this transformative thing. But the second thing that I see from the transformative moment was the fact that there was, let's call it a narrative that emerged that this was a Zulu uprising. It was not. It was not a Zulu uprising by any stretch of imagination. While there were Zulu people involved, it was not a Zulu uprising. And in fact, if you zoom out a little bit, you'll see that the build-up to this was around Nkandla, before Jacob Gedleyihle Kisha Zuma was put in prison. The name Gedleyihle Kisha is important because in the Zulu tradition, everyone is given a name. You get a given name and the name that your parents give you. And Gedleyihle Kisha means the man with a smile on his face that'll send you packing or that'll send you to hell, whichever way you want to interpret it in a narrow or broad context. So Gedleyihle Kisha, the man with a smile on his face that will send you packing, used that moment outside Nkandla to try and present it as if it was a Zulu thing. And he had what he claimed to be Amabutu, the traditional regiment of the king. He had Amabutu members there with him. And subsequent to that, we've now seen the king, the Zulu king, censure that commander, that Amabutu commander that was there. He's subsequently been reprimanded and relieved of his command post. So the Zulu king did not endorse that, and that implies that the Zulu nation does not endorse that. So it's not a Zulu uprising. It is a criminal uprising of people that happen to speak in this context because of the geographic location, that happen to speak Zulu, but it's not a Zulu ethnic uprising. That's important. So those are the two transformative things that I saw coming out of last week. But the other thing, let's go down to the Port Shepstone area now. Because what I saw happening when I drove through Port Shepstone was quite remarkable. There I saw, we got all these images of shopping centers burning and masses of people marching onto places, and almost like an unstoppable a column. The police were invisible. They were simply not there. The army was completely invisible. They were not there. They only arrived a week after all the trouble had happened. And what we saw in Port Shepstone was a group of people. Conspicuous amongst the group was the Muslim community that organized very efficiently, very effectively, and they prevented large-scale looting. In fact, driving through Port Shepstone today, Orabi Plaza is open and working. South Coast Mall is open and working. Shelley Centre is open and working. So the looters have been kept at bay only through the concerted attempts by the local community to rise. Now let's zoom out from that again, and let's try and put it into context. I'm going to argue that what we saw last week in our transformative week was the myth of the omnipotence of the African National Congress as a party of government. Now that's a profound statement, and some people might not like what I've said there, and I apologize in advance. The intention is not to offend. I speak truth to power, and I call it the way I see it. What I saw last week was the African National Congress not in control of the country, not in control of the police force, not in control of the army, to the extent that elements of the police force, where they were present, were in fact running out of ammunition. I'm talking about a Manzimtoti area. I'm talking about the sort of the south coast, just south of Durban, where the SAP were deployed, but they ran out of ammunition. They didn't have sufficient frontline ammunition, and in fact, they were resupplied by civilians, by private security companies. So I would argue that we saw the myth of the omnipotence of the African National Congress, and here I refer back to a statement made by Jacob Gedleyihlekisha Zuma when he was president of the country, that the ANC will rule until the second coming. Now that to me speaks to an arrogance of power, an arrogance of control, but an arrogance of power that is devoid of control, because it's really just about posturing. It's about an aspiration, but it's not about a reality on the ground. Because if you look at the reality on the ground, the very thing that Jacob Zuma is now accused of, the very thing that his trial is going to start bringing to justice now, is the issue of the arms deal and the first biggest corruption that happened in the South African government under African National Congress rule. And that arms deal, ironically, it criminalized parts of the African National Congress, criminalized those people, but it also robbed the security forces the very capability that they need now in the face of an uprising, the very capability. And in fact, if you look at when the military arrived, as I said, I'm an ex-military veteran, and we all looked at those vehicles coming in. Those rattles that came in were rattles that we fought in the Battle of the Lomba, all the battles in Angola. Those rattles are 40 years old. Those rattles have seen battle. They've not been upgraded since then. The Quefwells that came in and the Samels that came in, still with 6-1 neck stickers on the back of them. Those things look like they've just come out of Mavinga, in the last days of the Battle of the Lomba. They looks like they haven't even been cleaned up and repaired since then. So we're dealing with 40-year-old plus, maybe 40 to 50-year-old military hardware. We're dealing with with an arms deal that was supposed to replenish the Air Force, but we don't have helicopters functional. We have insufficient helicopters. We have a police force with dysfunctional helicopters. I'm told only 1 or 2 of them are flying around KZN because the others are grounded. So the arms deal that was supposed to strengthen the armed forces has done the opposite. It has weakened the armed forces. It has weakened the security forces, weakened the military in particular. And this is a very, very significant thing that I'm talking about, because while the military is now going to play a crucial part in KZN in general, but in South Africa in particular, at this very moment in time when they are being deployed internally, they are also being deployed externally in Mozambique. And this takes us back to that myth of omnipotence that I was talking about now, when the National Party were in power, when the National Party was fighting a war in Angola on the one hand, but they were also fighting an internal uprising on the other. And the National Party was unable to contain both, was unable to resource both of those things. They had to either fight the war in Angola or fight the internal uprising, but they couldn't do both, so they chose the negotiated route. So we're now at a situation where South Africa is now committing a force to fight jihadis in Mozambique, a serious commitment. This is not a Mickey Mouse thing that they're going to go and do. These are committed fighters. This is not just a little Sunday afternoon walk in the park. These are seriously committed people. So we are committing a force externally while at the same time having to deal with an internal uprising. And now I'm going to talk about another point. The other point is that in the 1980s, from the mid-1980s onward, South Africa faced another critical issue that most people are unaware of. The Chase Manhattan Bank declared sanctions on South Africa, and foreign direct investment was reversed. So we had an outflow of foreign direct investment from the mid-1980s onward. From the mid-1980s was the second uprising, if you like, of the early 1970s Soweto riots that were put down. So the Soweto riots were put down, confidence was restored. Mid-1980s, Sebokeng started burning again, and suddenly there was investor confidence loss, and Chase Manhattan Bank declared sanctions on South Africa, and there was a movement of capital outside the country to, if you take the movement of FDI as a percentage of GDP, it represented 5% of the GDP. So 5% of the GDP, net negative 5%, is what created the backdrop for the negotiated transition called CODESA. If we didn't have that net negative 5, we would have still been fighting the war in Angola today. We would have still carried on ad infinitum, and we'd be no closer to a solution. So that net negative outflow of 5% of GDP is an important number, because that defined the fact that the then National Party government was unable to sustain the military force externally and internally simultaneously, with most of the soldiers being citizen force soldiers like myself at that point in time, and like other people in this audience here today, I'm sure. They were unable to be fielded into a combat situation at the same time that they were expected to run their companies and keep the economy going back home. So now we get to the situation in South Africa where under Jacob Gedleyihlekisha's reign as president of the country, we had a thing called Marikana, the Marikana massacre. And the Marikana massacre triggered a massive net negative outflow of foreign direct investment from the country. And the number is quite significant, because the last data that I have is that it was net negative 25% trending towards 30. So here we have a net negative outflow of capital, 5 times the magnitude of what it was in the 1980s. 5 times and growing. So the question that I then ask is, how can we realistically face a situation where a net negative outflow of 5% in the 1980s created regime change? How can we realistically expect a net negative 25 not to have something, I'm not saying necessarily regime change, but something profound, something specific, something big that's going to happen? How is that not going to happen? How is that realistically not going to happen? So now that is an important number to understand. But the other important number to understand is that under the presidency of Jacob Zuma, state capture happened. And we know that for a fact now, for a legal fact, because the Zondo Commission of Inquiry tells us that. That's not an opinion, that is a fact. That is a legal fact. The Zondo Commission of Inquiry has found that the state capture happened, They have not yet quantified the full amount of money that was stolen or misappropriated. But the last number that I'm aware of was that 25% of, and possibly more, of the GDP of the country was plundered. 25% of the GDP. So here we have a situation where the country has been depleted by 25% of the GDP under Jacob Zuma's presidency. The African National Congress and the parliament that it sat in did nothing in terms of oversight. Scopa was ineffective, and the ANC members, Feinstein and these people that tried to blow the whistle on the deal, were in fact censured, and they now live in London. They no longer in South Africa because they've been chased away because they weren't allowed to oversee this thing. They couldn't stop the looting and the plunder. So here we have a situation where 25% of our GDP has been stolen, and at the same time, there's an outflow of foreign direct investment to the tune of another 25% of our GDP. And the difference between the net negative 25 and the net negative 5 of the 1980s was that the net negative 5 was institutional investment. It was bankers and financial institutions that were sending money out the country. The difference now is that it's individuals, private individuals, looking after their pension money, looking after their savings, putting it outside the country. So this is the background to what we've seen last week. So let's now get back into the sort of what we've seen, and let's take it forward. Is this a good thing or bad thing? Is it a disaster, or what is it? I see it as a hard reset. It's a hard reset because what it's done is it has exposed the myth of ANC omnipotence. It has exposed the myth that Jacob Zuma said the ANC will rule until the second coming. They will not. They will not. And in fact, I'm not saying when they will fall. We can't say that. I'm not saying they should fall. That's a value judgment. I'm not saying that either. What I am saying is that as an intelligence officer, I was put into Eastern Europe in 1989. I was in East Berlin the night the wall fell down. I was in East Berlin the night the wall came down. In East Berlin at the same time was a man called Vladimir Putin. You may know him. Vladimir Putin was an intelligence officer just like me. He was working for the KGB. He was based in GDR at the time. And when the wall was coming down, he was putting reports back just like I was putting reports back. And we were both reporting on the same events, and we probably reached different conclusions. But the conclusion that I put forward was that here we have the Iron Curtain, which in my lifetime came from nothing to be this powerful, omnipotent presence that nobody thought would ever fall. And here before my very eyes, little old ladies were putting down pieces of that wall. Skinny people with, malnourished people like this were breaking pieces of that wall. Not one shot was fired. The wall fell. The Berlin Wall crumbled without a shot being fired. The myth of omnipotence was exposed in 1989, December 1989. And it went, from there, the domino effect, they just fell like dominoes. When I watched Nicolae Ceausescu being arrested, I watched him slam his fist onto the table when he was being tried by a military tribunal and about to be sentenced to death by firing squad. And in that moment when he slammed his fist into the desk and he pointed his finger at the judges that were now about to sentence him to death, all military officers, senior officers. And he said that you are illegitimate. I'm the president. I'm the boss here. You have got no authority to do what you're doing. Very soon, that door is going to open and my security forces are going to burst in and arrest you and liberate me. He was taken out, put before a firing squad and shot. He's dead. He died. Within minutes, he was gone. So we saw the same with Erich Honecker. Who would have ever thought that the East German government, Erich Honecker, would not stand forever? It was swept away, just swept away. So we're dealing with a situation where nothing is given. Nothing is given. So the African National Congress, the myth of being in control has now been exposed. But the myth of racial tensions in South Africa has also been exposed. And the myth of an inept weakly organized civil society has also been exposed. We have a vibrant civil society. We are capable of organizing. We are capable of filling the vacuum left by what I call a failing state. And when I refer to a failing state, I define the failing state in a very precise way. I define the failing state in a way, and I'm going to share my definition with you now, and you'll see why I say it's failing. I see state failure as the inability of a unit of government. When I say unit of government, could be a municipality, it could be a department in the government, whatever, but it's a unit of government that gets signals from its operational environment, and it fails to interpret those signals into the need to take remediative action. And the inability of interpreting those signals to result in a viable response that is adequately resourced to reach the desired objective of changing that situation one way or the other. So we have it. We need look no further than Ugu. I've been writing a lot about Ugu, and I would argue that Ugu is an epicenter of state failure in KZN, just as Mfuleni is an epicenter of municipal failure in Gauteng. In the case of Mfuleni, you have the most industrialized municipality in Africa that has now got raw sewage running through the streets, that is unable to keep the lights on, unable to close the potholes in the road, unable to supply basic services. And here we have the least industrialized of municipalities, the Ugu municipality. That's no different. No different. And when you try and talk to the municipality officials here, they fob you off. They don't want to listen to you. They're just not interested. They really are not interested in any kind of constructive engagement, because they're in power. They're in power, but they're not in control. And that's the difference. So I'm going to wrap up now by saying that what I see in this transformative week is a remarkable rebirth, a regeneration of the spirit that we had building up to 1994 and the transition to the wonderful democracy that we became before we won the Rugby World Cup, that rainbow nation, when we were vibrant, when the world loved us, when our leaders were respected, when we were capable of doing amazing things, technologically, financially, medically, science, engineering, technology. We were world leaders at that point in time. We are at that transformative moment again now, when we are being purged of the ghost of the past, and we are now going to be able to renegotiate a better future for us. Now, I don't for a second call for any, because I'm an analyst. I'm an analyst, not an activist. And as an analyst, I look at things and I analyze them and I try and make sense. I'm not trying to push for any outcome. If I had to push for any outcome, I would say that the outcome that I pushed for in 1994, when a man called Eugene de Kock was blowing his bad breath into my face, because we were talking to the African National Congress behind the scenes about a negotiated transition, and he had the authority under a certain operational directive to take out, inverted commas, members of the security forces that were deemed to have gone soft on communism. And I was one of those people, because we were talking to the African National Congress in exile. The team that I was with opened up those channels of communication. We were the front end of that channel of communication. So we were talking to the ANC SACP in exile, which according to Eugene de Kock's definition now of his operational mandate, we had gone soft on communism. Therefore, we were the target. We could be taken out. And there were people taken out at that time. And I don't want to go into that sordid past. But we're at that moment again now. We're at that moment where a rejuvenated, a vibrant civil society is now regaining its self-confidence. But more importantly, just a week ago, analysts, including myself, were saying that the supply chain has been wiped out. Almost every analyst at that point in time was saying the supply chain has been wiped out. What do we see today? The supply chain is being rebuilt as we speak. As we speak, we see fuel trucks moving into garages and filling stations. We see bread services within 4 or 5 days of this drama. We saw bread trucks moving in. We saw the Muslim community coming forward and providing bread and milk to people at no cost. We've seen this alternative, redundant supply chain come into place very, very quickly. And that speaks to a resilience that the South African economy has, a resilience that's embedded in the hearts and minds of us, the people, we the voters, we the citizens of this country. We've been capable of putting that alternative supply network into place that is now capable of moving goods and services over vast distances in a very, very, very rapid period of time. The good news is that the major shopping centres in Port Shepstone were spared. Thank goodness for that. I was very concerned about the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. I've had my first vaccine shot in Shelley Centre, and I was very concerned that I wouldn't be able to get the second one. I was there yesterday or the day before, and they've got a supply chain going of those vaccines, so we're going to get our vaccines. So this is good news. So in summary, in closing, what I see coming out of this now is a rejuvenated South Africa. The green shoots coming out of the smouldering ashes of conflict and the unfinished business of the past, the unfinished business of the negotiated transition in 1994 is now coming to the fore. And we're going to renegotiate. And when I say I'm now as an analyst, I'm going to declare my interest now so that I can't be accused later on of being an activist. I'm going to declare my interest, and my interest is we need a stable constitutional government. That's what we need. Whether the government is ANC or PAC or DA or who cares? We don't care. As long as it is a responsive government that abides by the rule of law. And this is going to be my closing statement now. The central issue that I see that's emerged over the last week has been, on the one hand, the deracialization of the national discourse, but on the other hand, the emergence of one only discourse, and that is the discourse of the rule of law, where every single actor, whether it's a political party, whether it's a company, whether it's an individual, they're going to have to ask themselves the question, where do I stand vis-a-vis the rule of law? And the rule of law is the only conversation that's going to be had from now on, from an invigorated society. And I believe, just as when I was talking about Eugene de Kock at that point in time, I chose at that moment in time, when this man tried to intimidate me, to try and prevent me from doing the work I was doing with Neil Barnard in National Intelligence Service, I then made a logical choice. And my choice was, I will choose the side of constitutional democracy. And as a soldier, as an operator, that is what I will support. I am fundamentally a constitutional person. That's what I believe in the value of the rule of law. And once we start talking about the rule of law, how can we have any disagreements about any of the other things that divided us? Once we talk about the rule of law, South Africa is going to become an investment destination again, because we've got to reverse the outflow of 25% of our GDP that was stolen. We've got to recover that. And we've got to get another 25% back, because that's been the net outflow of our capital. So South Africa today is a capital, water, and technology constrained economy. And we're going to renegotiate that, or we're going to make a choice. And that we're at that binary moment. And the other choice is we're going to just go down the route of conflict, the route of conflagration, the route of anarchy, the route of another revolution, a second revolution. And I argue that that is in nobody's interest. So we need to operate within the framework of the rule of law. The local people that have risen and that have got their organized community policing forums or security platforms, whatever it is, manning the roadblocks, they need to make sure that they don't become vigilantes, because if they become vigilantes, they're now going to break the rule of law. They're going to be on the wrong side of the rule of law. So they need to make whatever arrests that need to be made, citizen arrest, hand it over to the police. Don't mete out justice. Don't shoot people. Don't beat them up. Don't videotape them while you're assaulting them. That is criminal. That is a criminal activity. So we need to restore the rule of law. And once we've done that, I believe that South Africa is going to move forward from this moment onwards in a much more confident way, because we're going to start seeing a return of the flow of capital. Not going to happen overnight, but in conclusion, I'll say that the African National Congress has now also at a pivotal moment, because a colleague of mine, the man that I reported to I became a founding member of the South African Secret Service in 1994 after Cadessa happened, when the services now were amalgamated and we had now created a new democratic dispensation, and we transformed the National Intelligence Service into South African Secret Service, SAS, and NIA, National Intelligence Agency. I was at that point in time, I was appointed as a staff officer to the Chief Director of Covert Operations and Counterintelligence. And that man was a former MK guy from Hibedin, nogal from Hibedin. And I reported to him, and he made a statement about a year ago on Facebook. And that statement also told me that things are changing, because here is an MK man, a man that was in prison, solitary confinement, all of the things that happened to people that were at the front end of the struggle. And he made a statement to the effect that what he sees now is that the African National Congress has become a criminal syndicate masquerading as a liberation movement. So if a senior MK man can say that, all I can do is I can say that this is what was said, and say something profound is happening here. So I believe that the ANC is now going to have a deep internal conversation about itself, and it's going to have to make a decision. And the way that I understand the South African dynamics, we've always pushed ourselves to the brink. And when we're on the edge of the abyss, staring down into that ugly place down there, the fire and the fury and the ugliness down there, we have instinctively recoiled, and we've instinctively reached out to each other, and we've pulled back from the brink. So I'm arguing now that the African National Congress will have its internal debate, its internal purging, if you like. It will re-legitimize itself. It will reclaim that 100 years of deep history, the history that enabled it to become a legitimate party of liberation, a legitimate party based on legal principles, and philosophical values. It will emerge from this rejuvenated, re-energized, and I will even argue that it is in our interest that there's not necessarily regime change. It's in our interest that we have a rejuvenated, stronger African National Congress, freed of this albatross around its neck, capable of governing, capable of attracting capital, because no matter where the capital comes from, we need capital to create jobs. In closing, 72% of our current youth are unemployed. That is a ticking time bomb. And that time bomb is driven by the fact that we are unable to attract capital into this economy. And we can either print our own money and go the Venezuela route, or we can look around and say we've got to renegotiate our position as a country vis-a-vis capital. What terms and conditions are we going to apply to capital? And if those terms and conditions are reasonable, we will start seeing a massive inflow of capital back into South Africa again. If we don't negotiate that correctly, we're going to stay as we are today. Stay as you are for the rest of your life, or you can change the mainstay. That's what I recall when I was a teenager growing up. Okay, that's I think pretty much my talk. That's off the top of my head and not prepared. I'll gladly take any questions, and I hope I haven't offended anybody. This has not been my intention at all. This is really just to try and give you a penetrating, sort of no holds bars understanding of where I think we are at the moment. So thank you very much. I hand over to the chairman. I'll gladly take any questions.
Thank you, Prof Turton. Thank you so much. I think on behalf of everybody here, I'd just like to extend our appreciation to you for taking the time to be with us and highlight all of these really important things. Thank you for sharing the events of your own life and for analyzing and unpacking it in such a way that we can hopefully understand what is going on around us within our own communities as well as in our country. You're definitely very fearless with your words, I must say, and we salute you for what you're doing for our community via your blog. I know it's educating a lot of people who don't have access. You know, what we see on social media is we can't always believe it or live our lives by it, but it's people like you that inspire others via social media. So we thank you for all that you're doing. And with your permission, I'd like to open up the floor to anybody who would like to ask Prof Turton any questions or maybe give any comments. I know it's a very touchy issue, but we are here to discuss and maybe just bring out anything that we can. Okay, I have Patrick with hands up. Patrick.
Professor, was your father a professor as well?
No, my father was a relatively uneducated man because of his poverty origins. He was only capable of getting a standard 8 education, but he was a very wise man, a profoundly wise man. But he went on to become a businessman. He was the first guy to put fruit into yogurt, believe it or not. So the first fruit yogurt in the country came from our father. But there's another branch of the Turton family that were medical doctors, and that's a different branch of the family, the same family, but a different branch. And in fact, there's another branch of the family that used to own property up near Heberden at a place called Turton. Believe it or not, there's a hospital there called Turton. So that's why I came to live here, because this is where my deep roots are.
Sorry, then the other one I just wanted to know, what about Ramaphosa?
Well, what about him? Ramaphosa is a man that how can I describe him? I think he's I'll use a military term to describe him. He finds himself in a minefield, and he has to walk a tightrope through a minefield. So he's a man of very good skills in terms of bringing together consensus. But he's also a man that has burnt up political capital. And I think part of the political capital that he's burnt is his unfortunate referencing to the white South African community in terms of his analogy of the boiling of the frog. He spoke about the slow boiling of the frog and the ultimate sort of decimation of the white minority in South Africa by means of the slow boiling of the frog, where you ramp up the heat so slowly that the frog doesn't know that it's being boiled. In my professional opinion, that has caused an enormous amount of damage to his brand, if you like, and it's going to take a lot of effort for him to recover. But I do know that he's in very close contact with Rolf Meyer, and Rolf Meyer is a man that I worked with many years ago. I know Rolf Meyer very, very well. In fact, I work through Rolf Meyer at the moment to a thing called the Public-Private Growth Initiative, PPGI. Rolf is working behind the scenes in the PPGI. Toyota South Africa is driving that. And the purpose of the PPGI is to try and drive 5% economic growth in South Africa over the next 20 years, simply in order to close the backlog in job creation. So I'm part of that initiative through the Water Chamber. I'm a founding member of the Water Chamber. But Cyril Ramaphosa, I think, is probably the best of the presidential candidates that we have. But unfortunately, he has tarnished his reputation with that unfortunate reference to the boiling of the frog. But if he's willing to come forward with bona fides, I'm sure that other people will find their bona fides.
I've heard this.
Thank you, Prof Anthony. Is there anybody else? It's 3 screens to move over, but if you just want to raise your hand or unmute yourself and we can listen. Yes, Patrick Elliott, floor is yours.
Thank you, Shaman. Professor, first of all, I'd like to thank Port Shepstone. I think this is a very productive get together, and I wish more people were in fact on. You've got a lot of people, 50 odd, but I think more needed to hear this evening. Is it recorded, and can I get a recording? That's my first question.
Yes, yes, Patrick, it is being recorded. I will liaise with Prof Anthony. I'm not sure on his thoughts of, how far and wide he wants it to go, but I'll put in my email address in the chat, and if you can just send me an email or a WhatsApp and say, please make it available. You were here, so I'm sure with Prof's permission, we can do that.
That's fair enough, and that would be 2 people we could perhaps keep within the ranks of our own families or immediate friends and not go public. Obviously, Professor must determine to what extent he's happy for it to go out to the greater community. That's the first thing, and I'd like to say I really appreciated a lot of the positive comment that came through from you. You clearly a man that's had a lot of experience and are very passionate in this field. I loved a lot of what you said. The only thing I would raise discussion around was the question of this is arguably orchestrated. What happened last week is arguably orchestrated, no doubt. But I don't think personally, I don't think to the depth that you went to, saying it started. I remember down the South Coast, they were shutting off the water, and there was a lot of damage to water infrastructure. Umzumbi was locked. We were down at Umzumbi. It was locked down. We couldn't get out of Umzumbi. And I don't tie that up to what happened last week. The Gini coefficient, the World Bank has clearly determined South Africa is one of the most unequal countries between the haves and the have-nots in the world. And we know for a fact, all of us know in our hearts, the majority out there are poor. They walk past these big supermarkets and shops with lovely fridges and stoves and all the rest. There are a lot of poor people out there. And I think it's more complex than being a military operation. I think it's certainly Zuma, in my own view, started the nonsense, and the way he's behaved and the fact that he's got a big following amongst certain of the Zulus. I think there are a large, I personally think more of the Zulus aren't with him, but there's a big contingent of Zulus that follow him and will do him. And that's where the problem is. And all it needed was that little match of hair started the fire, and what happened after that, certainly there were instigators, no doubt there were instigators that got it going. But I think the poverty in our KwaZulu-Natal is a big issue. And that's where we are at a watershed going forward. I think there have to be some changes. The government is clearly absolutely incompetent, and that we've seen with their the way they reacted from Ramaphosa all the way down, the police and the rest of it. That's the only area that I would discuss further around what is behind it. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, in fact. But I loved just about everything you said. It was positive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll respond to that by all means. Okay, so yes, I fully concur with the fact that we've got a very bad Gini coefficient, and I will fully concur with the fact that we're a highly unequal country. There's no doubt about that. However, now we get into another very interesting conversation. Why are we so unequal? Why have we become more unequal now than we were in 1994? Why? And I would argue that we've been at war against capital. There's been a war going on against capital. Now, no matter what the color of your capital is, you need capital in your economy. So I would argue that the reason why we are so poor today is not an ideological reason. It's because our policies have been of such a nature that we've made South Africa uninvestable. You can't sustain, you can't have a prosperous economy where on the one hand your president is enabling the theft of 25% of the GDP. 25% of the GDP is stolen. How can you have prosperity under those circumstances? How can you have prosperity under the circumstances where another 25% of your GDP flows out of the economy from 2013 onwards, from the Marikana incident? And if you look at some of my blogs, I've published some of those data sets. You can see it quite clear. Transition 2013, when the EFF was born, net outflow of capital, a massive amount of capital. So until such time as we stop the war against capital, we are going to continue to become poor. to the extent that the middle class is going to become poor, and the wealthy, the people whose life savings, and I see a couple of grey-haired people on the screen in front of me, your life savings are also going to contribute to that part. So I would argue that this invigorated conversation that I'm talking about now needs to look at poverty square in the eye. And let's say that the way to deal with this poverty is, do we deal with poverty by giving free basic grants to everybody? Who's going to pay for that? Where's the tax base of that? Or do we deal with poverty by unleashing the economy as we're trying to do through the PPGR to get 5% economic growth? We had 7% in the 1980s. 7%. Why can't we achieve 5% again now? But we can only achieve that if we really talk about the rule of law, because the rule of law is, I would argue, one of the inhibiting factors to the inflow of capital. The rule of law implies that if I own a piece of land and I have a valid contract and a title deed to that land, you cannot take it away from me. That's the rule of law. But of course, if we're now going to negotiate about the fact that we need to create deepen skills, we need to empower people. Do you empower people by mandating a 35% equity transfer just by virtue of the color of your skin? Or do you dignify black people by saying you are now able to become part and parcel of this new invigorated South Africa? In fact, I serve as a director on a BEE company, believe it or not. And part of that, what we're trying to do there is we're trying to dignify the process. We're trying to say that we've got skills and we've got capital that we will put into this investigation. It's not that you owe us. It's that what can we bring to make your business more successful? That's the way we do it. And that's, I think, this invigorated rule of law thing. But clearly, we have to sort out that poverty problem. I mean, that's a no-brainer. It has to be done. And I will argue that the reason why we're so poor is because of our policy choices. We've not had evidence-based policy reform since 1994. The last evidence-based policy reform we had was the National Water Act that was promulgated in 1998. Subsequent to that, there's been no more evidence-based policy reform. So we keep on flogging the same horse. We keep on trying the same failed policies, and then we wonder why we get the same outcome.
Thank you, Prof.
I agree 100%. Agree 100%.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Prof, I'd just like to go out to the chats. We have a question posed by Pam Picken, who says that the Mail and Guardian reports that this is just phase 1 of the revolution, and that the next phase includes attacks on Eskom, water, police stations, and the judiciary. What is your opinion, she asks?
I would caution on that kind of thing because, okay, let's unpack that. Firstly, it sounds like conspiracy theory, and I'm a little bit cautious about conspiracy theories. Secondly, I think what we saw last week was very possibly part of this big plan, and that this phase 1 and 2 and 3 might well be part of the big plan. But the fact that phase 1 has failed, they were unable to lubricate the cleavage line of race. They were unable to do it. They were simply unable to do it. And even with sophisticated attempts, and I'm going to refer to a sophisticated attempt here now, there was a video doing the rounds of an Indian community that was allegedly now attacking a squatter area. Now, that was designed to inflame race. And immediately after that, the Zulu king came forward, and he made a statement that the Zulu people are not at war with the Indian population of South Africa, the Indian community. So in other words, whichever way you want to slice and dice this cat, that the phase 1, whatever it was, failed. Who organized phase 1? Well, we don't know. We don't know. That will come out in legal investigation and criminal charges. And if we don't go down that route, then ultimately the ANC will not re-legitimize itself. So we're kind of almost like obliged. The ANC has almost backed itself into a corner where it's obliged to basically go down that route if it's going to be considered to be a legitimate party of government and reinvigorate itself as a legitimate government. So I think that the phase 2 and phase 3 might well have been on paper. I do believe that of the intelligence community. I've done a lot of analytical work on the transition of our different intelligence services, and in particular, I've been on the record as raising questions about the State Security Agency, the SSA. The reason why I'm no longer an intelligence officer is precisely because of the dynamics that were playing out at the time that was leading towards the State Security Agency. Remember, in my opening statement, I spoke about national security, securing the nation, creating a sense of national identity, versus state security, securing an illegitimate, embattled minority trying to cling to power. The State Security Agency is nothing more than BOSS. The State Security Agency to the ANC is nothing more than what BOSS was to John Foster. That's the reality of the situation. The difference is that BOSS fell on a 30 million rand misappropriation. The Zonda Commission has revealed that the State Security Agency has misappropriated something to the extent of R1 billion. So orders of magnitude bigger, but also the Zonda Commission has shown under oath that the State Security Agency had special operations running to try and manipulate the judiciary, to try and manipulate the media, to try and manipulate trade unions, etc. So clearly, there's clear evidence that elements of the State Security Agency were involved. Whether they were all involved, who knows? I don't know. It's a secret organization. I'm outside looking in. I would guess that there were some elements involved, and I would guess coming from that environment, I would say where there's smoke, there's certainly fire. And I would say that it's almost impossible to think of a future in which the State Security Agency will emerge from this unscathed and without being fundamentally restructured, because as they are today, they are potentially part of insurrection, part of sedition. I mean, this is treason. So there's a legal definition. The lawyers will fight about that. The investigators will put evidence on the table. That's not for a person like me to formulate an opinion on that. That will come out through a court of law. But these are the facts as I see them at the moment. I can't see them emerging unscathed.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. We're going to round up, but I know Lou Botha had his hand up. So Lou, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Prof. Your experience and insight is amazing. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Would you be prepared to consult to the intelligence structures of the current government to put them right, in a sense? Are you in that position, or would you feel that awkward?
Look, I go back to first principles. I'm a 12th generation South African. I love my country. I'm here. I'm not in Perth. I'm here because I believe in the future of this country. I've looked at the likes of the CCB and the flak blast units, eyeball to eyeball. I've been closer to them than most of you will have ever been in your life, and I've not blinked when I've looked at those people. So I believe in the future of this country. I believe in the future of constitutionality and the rule of law. So within that framework, I will talk to anybody, whether it's an investor, whether it's a government member, whatever. I believe we need to restore the rule of law. And there's a number of parallel things happening that you are not aware of. And one of them is a resurgence of people, of children, etc., of the security force people from the past, and they are pushing people like me forward now. They're saying that we need to hear the voices of the veterans, the legitimate voices of the people that were at the front edge, at the cutting edge. We need those voices have been silenced for too long. We can't just flush that experience away. We have to listen in dignity and with integrity to the complex history that we've come, the pain, the suffering. I mean, we've been through a deeply traumatic experience as a nation, and unless we can recognize that trauma with empathy, unless we can reach out across the lines. About a month ago, I was invited to a place in the top of Botha's Hill to come and talk to veterans, and there were MK and UPLA veterans there, and other veterans of liberation movements as well, with people with one eye and a hand blown off and one leg, and broken people that have been shot up and left in to fend for themselves. And the language that was common to all of those is that there's been pain and suffering. We need to reach out across this divide. We need to rebuild the integrity of our society. We need to overcome poverty, not by demanding that you will give me 35% equity in my company, but by negotiating a new peaceful agreement, if you like, that capital is no longer demonized, that capital can now come into the country and be protected and not be stolen and plundered. That's, that would be my answer to that thing.
Thank you. I'd ask you if you would make yourself available, if you could.
They know where I am.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof, for answering that. If there's any other questions, I don't see any hands up or nothing in the chat box. Fred, yes, Fred, we'll take one last question from Fred. Thank you.
Hi, Ant.
Fred, okay, Fred. I must tell you, this Fred, this guy that's going to talk now, he was my childhood hero, okay? He was my childhood hero. So Fred, my childhood hero, please talk now. I'm listening to you.
And we've had discussions at length, and what you've just come across with is very enlightening, and I agree with everything you say. But what I'm looking at is solutions, and from my point of view, I mean, I'm of a vintage where I've got still quite a bit to offer. What worries me about the leadership in the ANC at the moment is, first of all, the factionalism. Okay, the factionalism caused all this chaos that we experienced over the last week. Now, you're quite right in saying that the police and the security forces, well, the SANDF couldn't handle the situation, and they were brought into it too late. On the other side of it, the faction that caused this stuff, I don't know whether we can call it the Zuma faction, but let's for the moment say it was the Zuma faction. They also had limit to what they could do. Thank goodness. And I think they actually bit off more than they can chew. And then, you know, I'm involved with a local CPF unit, and exactly as you said, I mean, we manned road blockades here 24/7 for the whole week. And what we've picked up in the last, well, we were forced to abandon these blockades by the mayor of Durban and Zikalali, the premier of KwaZulu. And I just believe that they are in the other faction. And you know, I'd just like to know your feelings on how prominent these two factions are going to be for the future of this country.
Okay, well, Fred, that doesn't put me on the spot at all, because I think that we're going to reach deep again into what we are as citizens of South Africa. Every one of us are resilient, strong people deep in the marrow of our bones. And I think the same with the ANC. The ANC's got 100 years of history. It has got a brand. You know, if you want to talk about brand value, brand ANC is worth billions. I mean, it's a major brand. It's the oldest political party in Africa, created in 1912 in response to the then Native Land Act that eventually dispossessed 83% of the land and gave it to the white minority. Now, I mean, how noble is that? How noble is that? How noble is it? And I'm gonna make a statement now. When I was involved in the transition, you know what I looked at with tears in my eyes, with literally tears in my eyes, okay? What I saw was a country that had nuclear capability voluntarily relinquishing its weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear. Nowhere else in the world did that happen. But then I saw a prisoner of conscience, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, look at his prison, his warder, and say to his warder, you, my jail keeper, are as much a victim as I am. You also need liberation. That is remarkable. We are the only country in the world where we've decided to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where victim and perpetrator can be put eyeball to eyeball, and some form of catharsis and cleansing can happen. Now, many people criticize the TRC process. I've written in my book, I've got part about my little role in the TRC. I wasn't part of the TRC because I never committed atrocities. I didn't need to be forgiven for anything, but I did participate as a volunteer simply because I needed to cleanse my soul. I needed to cleanse my spirit. I needed to come clean of this, of 12 generations of anger and murder and mayhem and bitterness. So you know, what I'm saying is that we are a remarkable nation. And it's that remarkable aspect of our nation that is going to enable us to sit down now without the posturing, without the arrogance of power, And we're going to sit down once again and we're going to renegotiate a better future for us all. So that's the solution that I'm proposing. I'm talking about the emergence of the moderate middle. Now, what that moderate middle is, I don't know. But I think we're going to start hearing more and more people talking about the emergence of the moderate middle, because the moderate middle is currently being decimated. It's being eroded from both sides. So we've got to stimulate the emergence of a moderate middle, and we start locally. We build this thing piece in parts. We build a little local community, because the whole national security ethos that I'm part of, that national security ethos is based on looking at the security of the community, looking at your lowest level of analysis, which is the localized community, making them safe, so that ultimately their safety and security can be cascaded upwards, eventually, to provincial and eventually to national. So we build this from the bottom up. This is a grassroots kind of approach, and I think it's a powerful approach, because ultimately, it builds on this 100 years of ANC history. The last 25 years has been a bad history. This is when it became criminal. But the previous 75 years I think there's elements of glory in that part of it, okay? And I'm not ashamed to say that. I'm not a member of the ANC. I've never voted for them. I never will. But I've got to recognize that there's something of intrinsic value there. So we don't want to flush this away. We want to rejuvenate it. We want to make it noble again. This is what we need to do.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for that. I think we're going to round up. We're close on to 8 o'clock. Prof Turton, again, once again, on behalf of the Rotary Club of Port Shepstone, I would just like to really extend our appreciation to you for being here and for accepting our invitation to talk to us this evening. You've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, and for those of us who haven't had dinner yet, I think we have a lot more information to digest after our dinners this evening. Prof, I know you are spread very thin from, especially during this time, because of your vast intelligence and your knowledge and experience, but really we do appreciate you taking the last 2 hours or so of your time to be here with us. I'm sure that everybody who has been present at the meeting today will definitely agree that it has been a healthy conversation. It has been a superb presentation, and I, for one, have got a lot of information out from here. So thank you for that. And seeing that you are in Port Shepstone, I hope that you can make it to one of our contact meetings at the Rotary Club. So we'd like to see more of you. And on a lighter note, you'll definitely have my vote for councillors at the Hibiscus Municipality, or UGU, to see people like you make a change to our communities and to the bigger majority of our country as well. So, Prof, once again, thank you. We really do appreciate your time. And thank you to everybody who has accepted our invitation.
Giving me the...
Sorry, Prof, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to thank you for giving me the platform, because it's my wife and I are quite conscious of the fact that while we've had a property here for 17 years, we've mostly been holiday makers, and now we live here permanently. So we're trying to network, we're trying to embed ourselves, and it's an amazing place. I love this place very much. It's a good place to be. So thank you for giving us that opportunity. And you've asked for permission to distribute the recording. I've got no problem whenever I speak like this in public. I always work on the assumption that there'll be a journalist somewhere in the background, and whatever I say is got to be for public consumption. I never say anything in a sort of in a privileged way, unless it's a genuine privileged meeting, with the non-disclosure agreements in place, etc. So by all means, you're welcome to distribute this, because I think it's important that the spark must become a fire. We must convert the anger and the rage that we've seen in the last week to the rocket fuel of change, for this unstoppable movement of positive change, of which this is kind of like part of something, So yeah, I'm becoming an activist now, and I'll declare that, okay? We've got to convert that rage into high octane rocket fuel of change. That's my closing statement. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
And we're getting a round of applause virtually from everybody. We've really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who accepted our invitation to join tonight. We hope we'll send out more invites. We hope to get speakers of this caliber in future that can deal with issues that we are all experiencing. So we will continue to pray for our communities, for our countries. We will continue to support as the Rotary Club of Port Shepstone. We will continue to support our people here in the area, as we've been doing with the assistance of our members who are in the outskirts doing work and providing meals and clothes and what have you that is needed in our communities. So thank you all once again. And I would now like to conclude the meeting by handing over to our Sergeant in Arms, and that's Past President Clive Thompson, and he will just give us some humor and conclude as he did open the meeting today. Rightfully in Rotary, he will conclude as well. So thank you once again. Be blessed, be safe, and have a good evening. Thank you. Clive, over to you.
Thank you, President Sharman. The first thing I'd like to do is just recap on the birthdays that we missed. Sharman, of course, on the 7th. Happy birthday, Sharman.
Thank you.
And Ursula on the 18th, we missed her as well. And then, of course, a wedding anniversary is a big one. Eric and Teresa on the 23rd of the 7th. And Reggie and Sandy coming up on the 29th of the 7th. And happy anniversary to you guys. So just before our close, I'd like to say to you, Professor, I'm absolutely enthused with what you had to say. There are many families. We are a family involved where our family members are patrolling intersections from an ungodly hour of 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, it's akin to a horrible wartime situation where your family members, you didn't know if they were going to come back. And here we are, and I thought that we were over it. And as Professor said, there's a directive that road stops and blockages are going to be withdrawn. And here we are, and this is not fear talk, but here we are. I have 4 businesses in Port Shepstone of others that I have that have armed guards for the weekend at huge cost because they're under threat. So I don't think that we should be apathetic about the threat. Whilst we think that things are very much better, let's just be aware. And I must tell you that the time we've been through, as people that have not gone through war times, I lost a family member in Angola. So it's a horrible memory of these kind of times. So to all of our friends that are with us tonight, take care of yourselves. We were supposed to be with Patrick and Jill over this last weekend, and we couldn't go up there. My whole family were going up there because we were going to have the party of our lives. But Patrick and Jill, you're not leaving here alone. So I think what we should do is we should end the evening with an element of humor. We agreed?
Yes, exactly.
And it's a really humorous thing. We're into the kids stuff. And it was a cold winter day when an old man walked out onto a frozen lake, cut a hole in the ice, dropped his fishing line and began waiting for a fish to bite. He was there for almost an hour with even a nibble when a young boy walked into the ice, cut a hole in the ice, not from far. The old man dropped in his fishing line. A bit of a narrative there. It only took about a minute and wham, a largemouth bass hit his hook and the boy pulled in a fish. The old man couldn't believe it, but figured out it was just luck. But the boy dropped in his line again and within a few minutes pulled out another one. He went on And until finally the old man couldn't take it anymore, since he hadn't caught a thing in all this time. He went to the boy and said, "Son, I've been here for over an hour without even a nibble. You have only been here a few minutes and you've caught about half a dozen fish. How do you do it?" The boy responded, "Ram and run rab." "What was that?" the old man said. Again, the boy responded, "Ram, ram, ram." Look, the old man said, "I can't understand a word you say." So the boy spat the sweet out of his mouth and said, "You got to keep the worms warm." Okay, that was more.
We look forward to seeing you in Clatouri for some more jokes.
You must go and keep your worms warm if you want to catch the fish. But at the same time, I thank God that we have the community that we have in Port Shepstone, because believe you me, and Patrick and Joel, you know them well. So do we.
Yes.
Believe you me, we have the most wonderful getting together of our community, and I have no qualms in saying every aspect of our community. The Muslim community of Port Shepstone have been absolute miracles in our defense. I have several members of staff in our community, plus a greater community, and I actually said to one of them who are down in the Margate area, "Tell me, what support are you having from the greater community?" And he said, "Let me tell you that we are undivided. Every one of us from every segment of the community is totally against what is happening. And this is a segment of the community which are hell-bent on destruction, and we are going to make sure that our people in this greater area are protected." So, Professor Turton, I thank you very sincerely. I know that our president has thanked you, but believe you me, in what you've shared with us has made us very much more confident, and I hope to God that all of us can see this through. And I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
Well done. Well done, Chippy.
Good night, everybody.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Prof.
night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Jill and Pat.
Hi. Who's that? Pierre. And Elby.
Hi, Els. Hi, Pierre.